Welcome to the Fearless Health Podcast with host Dr. Anne-Marie Barter.
Dr. Sethi, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you here today. Can you please tell us how you got into the integrative medicine space and everything that you're doing? Love to hear your story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today, Dr. Barter. So, my journey kind of started when I was a little younger. I was in college and had gotten a phone call actually from my sister telling me that my dad was very ill. He was in the hospital and was being diagnosed essentially with cardiovascular disease. He had, I think, 4 or 5 arteries that were blocked at the time. Now, we didn't know that he had any history of heart disease or diabetes or anything that, would be risk factors for this condition. But essentially she told me that he had to stay in the hospital. They were going to be cracking his chest open tomorrow and doing bypass surgery. So you can imagine my shock, feeling like my father was a healthy man and then knowing that, he was going to be undergoing this really huge surgery that, could indeed result in him not making it through. So he did make it through. And it was in that moment that, I had actually been reading a book by Deepak Chopra called Spontaneous Healing, and another one with Dr. Andrew Weil about nutrition and optimal health. And I started really considering the fact that, his condition could have been prevented. And, he had the bypass surgery and was given some basic recommendations like eat a low-fat diet and try not to eat sugar and make sure you exercise. And you can imagine how that story plays out. Many of your listeners probably know that, those sorts of recommendations weren't really helpful over the last couple decades to most people, and his health continued to deteriorate. So when I was looking at, what I wanted to do with my life, I decided that I wanted to go into healing, and had really kind of approached that through medical school, and chose to go to osteopathic school. And then when I completed that, really found myself wanting more information about, natural ways to heal the body, really understanding how it was that my meditation practice that I'd had since I was around 13 or 14, might be having an influence on my health. And from there, did my fellowship with Dr. Andrew Weil, who, had been a mentor of mine through his books, and continued on my journey with functional medicine. And at some point realized that in my conventional practice, I just wasn't really getting the opportunity to integrate those principles, a lot of it being lifestyle medicine and a real understanding that health doesn't happen in the doctor's office, but really happens in our patients' lives. So I left, my conventional practice and opened up my own integrative and functional medicine practice, and kind of got to this point.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I want to come back to the meditation piece, but I want to touch on something that I think a lot of people are confused about. There's definitely 2 subsets of practices. There is the functional integrative approach, which you're now doing, and then there was just the traditional approach. How are these 2 practices different? Like what do you see the differences in these 2 practices, since your toe has been in both sides of the water, really, right?
Absolutely. So, I would describe kind of traditional or conventional medicine practice as more of treating symptoms and treating disease. And so oftentimes, what happens is patients come in and we might say something like, we're starting to see some increases in your blood sugar, or there's some lab work that's suggesting that you might be prone to cardiovascular disease because your cholesterol is elevated. And so what ends up happening is that there might be some small recommendations given, like, oh, you really need to change your diet or go out and exercise. But, for the most part, you kind of wait until the disease already happens in the body before we begin to treat it. So it's really more akin to sick care. We kind of wait for people to get sick before we actually provide them with resources or treatments. And my interest was really more in prevention. And what I found is that by understanding from an integrative medicine standpoint or functional medicine standpoint, we can really understand that there are root causes that oftentimes, disease is starting 10, 15, 20 years before it manifests as symptoms in the body. And so there are ways to acknowledge that and understand that, if we were to change the way we eat or change the way that we move or change how we sleep or be managing our stress, day in and day out, that we would really prevent kind of that tipping over point into where we end up with chronic disease and symptoms. So that's kind of what defines the difference for me. And of course, I do walk the line. I do walk, right down the middle of those, because sometimes we do need to use prescription drugs. And so I think that they're for acute things and for life-saving type emergencies, there's nothing better. We've made great strides in medicine, but what we really have not come a long way is understanding, well, how do we prevent that to begin with? And many of these older traditions of medicine, like, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, medicine that's coming from sort of South America, they knew how to do that really well. And so a lot of those modalities, understanding how to use herbs and, spices and things like that in your healing every day, have been integrated now into the integrative medicine
Right.
practices.
That's so well said, and I completely agree with you. It is amazing in South America countries, South American countries, that they will just go through and they'll be like, that's cinnamon, that's for blood sugar, that's this, that, and they can just pick it off the tree and they know exactly the condition that it's for. They've been doing this for such a long time. I got such an education when I was down there, and how amazing these people are, and they're just really honed in on their environment.
Yeah, and I have found, now doing the work that I do, that the herbs almost every single time work better than the prescriptive medications. And I think it's just because there are just other properties of plants that assist us in maybe supporting our immune system while it's killing, they're killing bacteria or parasites or whatever, that the drugs just can't do, because they're singularly, one or two ingredients. So yeah, that's wonderful.
I completely agree. And I think it's just the part, pharmaceuticals absolutely have a time and a place, right? But when you're really looking at the whole plant, it just assists so much more versus a micro dose of a hardcore pharmaceutical. And sometimes that's indicated, it just depends. So you touched on meditation, which is so cool and so interesting, because you have a very lifestyle driven practice. That's what you've said, and really transitioning people's lifestyle to be healthier overall. So how does meditation work into your practice, and what results have you seen from meditation?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because I would say, if I had to pick the one thing that has probably, pushed the needle the most for my patients, it is having that practice in their life. And it could be a breathwork practice, or it could be a meditation practice. I think breathwork is oftentimes used to get the body ready, for the meditative practices. And so the way that we approach it in my practice is, patients will oftentimes come in, and, the thing that's easy to gravitate towards are the labs and, the data and, the diet. And we do all that, and that's fine. I think that's, it's getting the body kind of prepared and, de-inflamed and all of that. But, it's almost a non-negotiable, to be honest, in my practice, that my patients at least try to engage in something on a daily basis. And so I'll oftentimes get them started if they've never sat in a meditative practice, or had a walking meditation, which is perfectly fine, or, done a breathwork practice. Then what we'll do is we'll start with just some simple, either 1-minute mindfulness practices, where I ask them to really focus on the breath for 1 minute at a time. And, anybody can do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the practice really of just bringing your awareness back to that thing. And in this case, it would be the breath. And so we know, so one of the biggest, I would say, issues that people tell me they have is they say, well, my mind wanders. I just can't quiet my mind. I'm not a great meditator. And, here's the truth. Your mind is supposed to wander, right? You're supposed to be generating thought. That's what it does. That's its job. But what you come to realize is that your consciousness, or your, the part of you that's kind of aware of what your mind is thinking, and knowing that you're having thoughts, that is actually separate than your thoughts. So that's actually, when you bring that piece, or what I'm going to call attention, back to your breath, you're taking it off of your thoughts. And so the practice of meditation is simply just focused attention or focused awareness. And so, every time your mind wanders and you notice that now you're down, this long path of, oh my gosh, I have to get the kids, and then there was this, and then that, and oh, geez, my mind wandered again. That's okay. You just bring it back to the breath and back to the breath and back to the breath. And even advanced meditators will tell you that some days they might have 1,000 thoughts, every second, and some days they notice that the thoughts are really quiet and they're able to really focus on that breath. So that's a way to start. I'm also a big fan of technology, and I oftentimes will direct people towards HeartMath and Muse. So these are two tools that will help you to use biofeedback to train yourself in meditation. The first being HeartMath, and what it's doing is actually measuring your heart rate variability. And when we notice that your heart rate variability goes into what's called a coherence pattern, it flips your brain into that coherence pattern as well, which gets you into that meditative state. So it's just a little tiny, kind of looks like this, the headphones wire clips to your ear, hooks up to your phone, and you start to focus on the breath and focus on the breath. And as you get your heart into that coherence rate pattern, you're going to notice that the colors on the app change, and you get that biofeedback to start to change your breath or to focus again on the breath. The other one is the same sort of idea, but it's focused on the patterns that are put out by your brain. So the EEG, and it's called the Muse. And it's this little headband that you kind of hook up here. And what's really cool about it is, if you like to listen to the ocean, let's just say, you can set your app on that. And then as your brain waves go from, beta, which is the brainwave pattern we're in right now because we're focused and we're having this discussion, into alpha, which is when the body starts to relax and kind of you start to sort of not focus in as well, into theta, which is meditation, you're going to notice that the ocean starts to calm down and you start to hear birds chirp, and it's really calm. And then as you begin to generate thoughts and you're focusing on your thoughts, you notice that the ocean gets stormy again, and reminder, okay, back on the breath, focus back on the breath. And you notice. And so in this way, you can use these tools to really begin to train yourself how to meditate, and you can see the feedback, which I think is really cool for people. So that's one of the, those are some of the ways that I get started with my patients.
And I think that's great, because the biggest complaint that I've heard about meditation is a lot of type A personality types want to do it right. They just right and well, and they want to, and so they feel like they're failing when their mind wanders, or when thoughts come into their head. They feel like they're failing at this and they can't do it. And since they're so driven and so A-type personality, right? And I can relate to that because I'm very A-type. But they just feel like they're a failure, and then they put it down because they're not good at it. Because they've been good and high achievers at all these things their entire life. And they're who needs this because they're wired but tired. And so, they're just an incredible fatigue all around and completely stressed out and hard pushers, but they just feel defeated. So what have you seen meditation improve in people's health?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I want to follow up what you just said with, there's no such thing as a bad meditation.
Thank you. Yeah.
No such thing. Because really it's just the practice. It's like, okay, if you go to the gym and you work out, but it wasn't the best workout, you didn't fail your workout. You still worked the muscle out. So it's the same process. So kind of wrapping your head around that a little differently. So the benefits that I've seen are just so across the board. Let me start with some of the kind of parameters and symptomatology that I see improve. I've seen blood pressure improve. I've seen blood sugar improve. I've seen inflammatory markers get better. I've seen people's, thyroid and hormonal levels begin to balance out. We know that meditation has a very specific effect on the gut microbiome. So it does allow for the better types of microbes to really thrive. And that really makes sense because you're decreasing your cortisol adrenaline response, in the adrenals, and allowing that gut to just really be in parasympathetic state. We know that you're going to absorb your nutrients better. I mean, you actually get about 50% better absorption when you do have a breathwork practice or even a short meditation practice prior to eating a meal. And I think that's why, for centuries, we've had people, pray, right? Or go into a state of gratitude prior to having the meal, because we know that it improves absorption of food and nutrients. So those are some of the big ones, and then if we really want to talk, I think what's really exciting right now is that we have the ability now to really understand very specifically what meditation is doing in the brain from the aspect of neuroplasticity. And so I think that's where it gets really exciting, because we can actually look at groups of people who have never meditated, put them into a study where they meditate, and look at whether or not, parts of their brain have changed. And we are seeing that, in fact, it does. We're seeing that there's increases in the hypothalamus. We're seeing increases in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe being the part of the brain that is really associated with increased creativity, the feeling of wholeness, just knowing that, we feel connected to things, feeling more love and joy and bliss in our lives. And that kind of the other part of our brain, the amygdala, where the fear response, where we sit when we have a lot of stress and anxiety and we're kind of in that survival, it tends to get less activated, in these people. We can also take people who are, long-term meditators and kind of see, what their brains look like, compared to, participants that match them in age and lifestyle, and kind of notice differences there. So those types of studies have been done. Now, what we're seeing more and more of is this ability to take what we call brain mapping, or the ability to actually use that technology that I was describing, like the Muse, and look at when people really are in meditation. So we can see when they get into that theta wave pattern or even high gamma wave pattern that they are in a deep meditation, and then be able to measure what serum markers are being produced, and are they producing anti-inflammatory type markers in their body. And so those studies there are some that have been done, and there are some that are happening currently. And so taking a lot of that data and then sort of going, well, then how does this influence, longevity? How does this influence overall chronic illness? How does this influence changes in the brain's ability to react, to situations very quickly in an anxiety type of way or a calm type of way, is, I think where we're headed with all this data. And what it seems like is happening, and I'm going to say, right now we've got some evidence for this, but this, this is kind of still being, understood a little bit more, is that when we are in these deep states of meditation, like theta and gamma, and we can measure them via EEG, we believe that, there are parts of the brain that are being activated very specifically, the pineal gland and the pituitary glands. And we know that those particular glands put out a number of hormones. The pineal gland specifically puts out melatonin, which, we've come to learn a lot about melatonin, I would say, just in the last decade or so. We used to think, well, it's just something that the brain produces to make you go to sleep. It's a hormone that's responsible for a lot of different things. And interestingly, the metabolites of melatonin are things that we're all familiar with, like benzodiazepines, like Valium. Right. So it's why when you're in a meditative state and you're activating melatonin production, it'll metabolize into things that relax your body so that you can stay relaxed through the meditation. We also know that some of the metabolites look like DMT, which is a very powerful hallucinogen that we know of. And it's why when some people get into deep states of meditation, they might notice that they're having really, really vivid, kaleidoscope-like type imagery that's coming in. We also know that some of the antioxidants that are metabolized from melatonin are really, really powerful, and they actually will signal the genes in an epigenetic fashion to turn things on or off in a really powerful way and a healing way. So it's kind of like you have this pharmacy in your brain available to you. And the way to activate it is by getting ourselves into these deeply relaxed meditative states. And then the pituitary gland specifically, the posterior pituitary releases things like vasopressin and nitric oxide, which we know increase blood vessels expand, and vasopressin acts to dilate the heart. And it's why oftentimes people will come out of these states of meditation feeling, just like their heart is really open and they're feeling a lot of love and joy. And ultimately, I think that's a state that we're all looking for. So imagine starting your day every day with that just open feeling of feeling connected and creative and, loving and joyful and looking forward to your day, instead of waking up every morning thinking, oh yeah, here's another day. I've got my chronic pain. I've got my, my headache. Is that going to happen today? I've got this work I have to go to that I'm not excited about. Oh yeah. And then there's that friend I had that fight with. And, and instead starting your day with just this feeling that's really induced by all the hormones and chemicals that our brain produces from a state of meditation, starting our day with that beautiful feeling of, joy and excitement. So that's what I see happen the most, is that I start to see that my patients they just approach their lives differently. Their mindset literally changes. And I think we're getting very close to seeing how that really does induce kind of a rewiring of the brain, so that they're not reacting as quickly to the things that used to trigger them before, or maybe they would get anxious about before, and just have like an alternative pathway to go down instead of the one that they've been used to.
Wow, that is powerful for meditation. For starters, meditation's free. It's completely accessible to you. You don't need to do any, I mean, that is a lot of benefits. I did not realize that about melatonin in the pineal gland. I had no idea. So that's a new information for me, but that is quite powerful. So so you have a patient come in that is wired but tired, anxious, and in chronic pain, and with you recommend meditation, diet, other lifestyle changes, which we'll get into in a bit. But how much change are you just seeing with the meditation alone with this patient?
That is such a great question. And I'm going to just be really, transparent here and tell you that I've been to enough meditation events in my life, like where, where I engage in these week-long events with people. And I have seen people, I've seen this with my own eyes, and I'm a scientist, right? I'm a doctor. I've seen people come in with, chronic debilitating pain in a wheelchair with a walker. It could be anything from, spinal stenosis to a musculoskeletal disease to Parkinson's and, rheumatologic conditions. I have literally seen them, commit to the practice and really get themselves into that state of bliss every day, to where they rewire their brain enough that by the end of the week, they're up and, at least taking their first steps out of that walker without pain, or, just willing to move their body in a different way. And the energy is through the roof. So I would say, if somebody really commits to this and they are, they're doing it, and they just decide that their body is, the body has to follow the mind. So when we think something or we have a thought, the body's going to follow, right? So you get a signal that you have to use the bathroom, and you have the thought, oh, I got to go to the toilet, I got to use the bathroom. You just go, your body follows, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way, if your thoughts change to, I am whole, I am healthy, I am pain-free, I have unlimited energy, and you believe that every single day, and you do your meditations and connect in with that feeling, then what happens is you begin to feel the emotions of that wholeness and that unlimited energy and that pain-free state, right? And the body doesn't really know the difference between something that's actually happening externally and something that's happening in our mind alone. When we look at the changes, there's some very interesting studies that have been done And what they do is this has been done in sports a lot. And then, they've done other studies where they've, for example, taken people who have, never shot baskets, right? And so they'll give, lessons and set one group up, and they learn to shoot baskets. And then another one, they just tell them to sit and actually envision the shooting the baskets, and with their entire body, what would they be moving, how would that feel, what would it sound like, what would it smell like to be out on the court playing. And then at the end they actually measure kind of the muscle, and then they have another group which is a control group, and they're not doing anything, they're just sitting on the couch. And at the end they measure kind of the muscle growth that would be used in shooting the hoops. And they actually see a 30 to 40% increase in those muscles. Those people didn't do anything but sit on the couch and envision that they were doing this, right, in the correct way. And they had growth. And the same thing happens with people that they've done a similar study, and they've asked them to play a song on the piano, right? They see that the impulses to certain fingers that were utilized in playing the piano, they've never played the piano before, as well as musculature has increased. And so when we look back at some of these like high performing athletes, Michael Phelps being one of them, it's really interesting because people would always ask him, what is it that you do? How do you win, so often? What do you do to prepare for competition? And he says, I just think about it and like imagine myself there from start to finish every single day. Every morning he wakes up and he imagines himself on that starting block, diving in, what the water feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, doing that race and coming back. And he starts his day that way every day for months. So the brain is having the thought. The brain then produces the hormones and the signaling to the body to activate the right muscles and the right set of hormones and chemicals. And then by the time he gets to the race, the body has already experienced it. So it's already had the experience and it knows what to do. It's just going to follow. So I think that's a really fascinating way to explain, what I think we've all historically thought of as, manifesting things, which maybe didn't have any scientific basis for before, but this is how it actually happens. And we now can understand that because we have the ability to do those studies. So for that person who, comes in with tired, but, wired, but tired and with chronic pain, imagine starting your day every day, feeling what it would feel like in your body with unlimited energy and, playing ball with your kid, taking a run on the lake, taking your dog out for a walk without having the pain, like really, really buying into that and feeling it in your body. You will see that there will be changes that begin to happen in the body that begin to change the production of neurochemicals and things in the body that signal the right genes to turn on and start producing the right proteins to make some of those, some of the body get back to wholeness. So that's kind of, I think, what, where I see this work going.
I think that's amazing. I had read the similar studies of people that were performing the task versus the control group versus the people thinking about the task. And in the study that I read, the people performing the actual task and the people sitting on the sidelines visualizing themselves performing the task had something between a 10 to 20% difference only from the people performing the task. That's outrageous. That's incredible. So, very powerful. That is an awesome plug for meditation. I will just say that. For starters, I'm like completely enthralled in this. But you do so much more than just recommend that people meditate and practice. So,
of course.
I want to go into that a little bit. Are some of the things that you really are focusing on with lifestyle changes and practice, and what you really feel like also moves the needle? So I'm curious what those are.
Absolutely. Well, certainly, if we look at kind of the word, yoga even, and understand that what it means is union between the mind and body, and really kind of the origins of it, the idea being that the reason to do those practices, and even Ayurveda, which was more of like the cleansing of the body and keeping the body clean by having the right food in the diet, it was about preparing kind of this body, right, for the energy to move through without, obstacles, right? And to prepare to be able to sit in meditation, honestly, that was kind of where yoga started. That's why it was, to prepare the body to allow it to be flexible to sit. So of course we have to work on the physical. And I think that, the thing that people always want to know is, what's the right nutrition for me, right? How am I supposed to eat? I think it's really, really easy to sell diet out there, and I think that it's low-hanging fruit in some ways. There was even a show on TV once it was like a reality show called My Diet is Better Than Your Diet.
Oh wow, I never saw that.
And I heard at a nutrition conference once that, like, asking somebody change their diet is like asking them to change their religion, right? It's like it's a big deal.
It is.
So I think, I think there is a lot of importance to it. I think that maybe we put a little bit too much importance on it and not enough on some of the other things as well. But generally speaking, I mean, my go-to is, really an anti-inflammatory diet, or, a lot of times I'll start people off on something like the Whole30. But I think if we look at longevity studies, we're really talking about, eating things in moderation, really sticking to foods that are kind of anti-inflammatory. So I do get into that with my patients. We do, and I'm sure you've, had other guests, and, you talk with your patients a lot about diet. So without getting into the specifics of any one diet, I think that what we have to recognize as well is that cooking and working with food, it can be so enjoyable. And I think sometimes when we restrict so much, it becomes so stressful that people don't want to cook, and they don't. I have so many patients come in that are so restricted in their diets because they've, read something, or, done work with other practitioners or whatever it is, and they have done some food sensitivity tests and stuff like that. And it's really taken the joy out of eating. And it's so interesting to me that we're in a time where that we have an abundance of food, and yet we're so stressed out by it.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, like it used to be that the stress was there was no food. Like you literally didn't have food, and you would starve until you had to find food. And that was a stressor, that was a real stressor on our body. And now it's, there's that. Plus there can be a lot of things in our food, right, that really do put a stress on our body. So, sticking with organic as much as possible, really sticking with an anti-inflammatory diet. It's really important to look at your, blood sugar, and whether or not you're eating foods that convert very quickly into elevating your blood sugar, because that blood sugar response is key to really maintaining an anti-inflammatory type body, as well as really preventing inflammation in the body, which we now know is kind of the leeway to so many other chronic illnesses. So when we talk about nutrition, that's what I focus on. I also really try to bring in healing spices, because I think that in our country here, people are so unfamiliar with cooking with spices. And that might be because we've just kind of, gotten used to eating out a lot. And so we don't really know what's in our food. But there are so many amazing benefits to cooking with spices, and it can be so fun and really bring the joy back in to cooking if you just start to experiment with those.
Can you go over some of the basics with cooking with spices? Because a lot of folks say, I have spices on my shelf. They've been there for 5 years. I'm still using it. I'm trying to get through it, 2 years, whatever it is. But a lot of times the spices have sat on the shelf for too long, or just some of the basics with that to actually get the most out of your food.
Of course. That's a great question. Yes. Please don't buy like those, racks that come with pre-filled bottles of spices that may have been sitting in the warehouse for 5 years before it ends up in your home. There's no benefit. If you open up a spice and you cannot smell it, that means the aromatic oils are not there any longer. They've dissipated into the air. And so the benefits are very, very, very minute with those particular spices. So generally speaking, trying to buy things, if you can buy things whole and you have a little spice grinder, like a little coffee grinder, that's the best way to optimize the healing benefits you're going to get from your spices. But if that seems like, okay, that might take a little time, then what I recommend is you buy from sources that are probably the bulk section of your grocery stores are going to have fresher because they're going through it frequently, so they're replenishing it. And just making sure that you can smell it before you buy it. If you can smell it, and the stronger the smell, the more medicinal the spice is. And then when you get home, most things can be stored just in a cabinet, not exposed to sunlight, because a lot of those volatile oils will, when they are exposed to light, they're going to start to break down. But if you put it in a darker cabinet, then that's fine. Whole spices will last longer, generally speaking, if you keep it in the fridge. And then you just take it out and grind what you need for, a few months and kind of put that in your pantry. And then other than that, I think that rules around spices, to release some of the flavor and the medicinal compounds, a lot of spices require fat. So things like turmeric, which I think a lot of people now know, you have to really take it with fat or oils to be able to absorb it. You actually increase the absorption by like 50 to 60%, as well as with black pepper, because there's piperacillin in pepper, and the enzyme there helps to activate that. Same thing with, some other spices as well, like cumin and coriander. So trying to make sure that, if you're going to use those, that you're not just kind of at the end sort of putting the spices into your food as a dry powder. You're probably not going to really activate the spice very much.
That's a really good tip. Yeah, because a lot of people will do something at the end versus, through the cooking process to activate it. I didn't even think about that.
And it's best, a great way to, so with powders, you can do what's called, where you take a dry pan without oil, and you just for like maybe 30 seconds to a minute, you kind of heat that powder over the heat, and then you can add in your whatever else you're adding, and that'll start to activate it. With whole spices, you can actually cook them a little bit before you begin to add in your onions or your garlic or your vegetables or whatever, for about a minute. And when you put it into the fat in the pan or in the oil in the pan, the minute you begin to smell the aroma of the whole spice, like let's say you're using whole cloves or coriander or something like that, the minute you smell it, that's when it's ready, and then you add all the rest of your stuff.
Well, that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. So it almost sounds like cooking Indian food. That's how it sounds. Like, it's my favorite. It's all spiced out, like tons of spices. I love it. But that almost is what it sounds like, because it seems like the process that they go through, or, the steps: spices first and then start to add in the rest of the ingredients.
Well, there was a reason for that. If we think about it, the Indus Valley, which wasn't India at the time, right? It was just the Indus Valley, is one of the world's oldest, cultures, right? And so they studied things that worked and didn't work. I mean, a lot of things that we're discovering now, they've known forever. It's part of the Ayurvedic, textbook, which is the textbook of medicine, in India, because they had studied these things. And also the combining of things together, like understanding that, for example, if you're eating tomatoes, you might see it as cut up fresh tomatoes in one recipe, and then in another recipe, it's cooked down with fats, because you'll get fiber from a raw tomato, but you won't activate lycopene, which is a really powerful antioxidant that can help with, preventing breast cancer and prostate cancer. So to activate lycopene, you've got to cook it down and with fat, and that's how you release the lycopene and be able to absorb it. So in some of those older traditions that have been around for a long time, you'll see that the foods and spices are prepared in lots of different ways, because you do get different benefits depending on how you cook the foods.
Wow, that's really neat. And I think I can hear the question or the comment already. Well, I don't know how to cook. I don't really know where to find a lot of this in my grocery store. I can't do a diet. That's too challenging. What do you say when you meet objections about changing the diet or cooking more at home. I think just not even changing the diet, but I think cooking at home is a real challenge for a lot of people. And how do you remove that barrier for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are living in a time, well, to be honest, it can't be easier to do right now because we are surrounded by a variety of things. So for one, there are services like Sunbasket, and there are a number of these services where they will literally send you, and you can pick, like, I want a Whole30 approach or a paleo approach or a vegan approach or whatever you want, and they will literally send you the portioned out foods, with the spices already there. And all you have to do is kind of follow the recipe and kind of throw it together. Usually it takes 30 minutes. So there's that option. I think it was a great way to get started. You can also go to your grocery store and kind of get the semi-prepared foods, where it might be like, here's some uncooked salmon with, a side of green beans, and it'll tell you kind of what's on the salmon. And then you take it home and you kind of just follow the oven instructions, right? I think that's a great way to kind of start if you haven't ever done, and then just add what you want to it. I mean, it's your food, so, if you're familiar with, if you grew up with spices like oregano and rosemary and thyme, use those. If you're unfamiliar, or you don't know how to cook with turmeric and coriander and cumin, then maybe, one thing that I've done with my friends, well, two things actually, which could be really fun, I think, for people to do. So we currently have a cookbook club, and we meet every 6 weeks. And when we put our group together, we all sort of realized that we were all at the same kind of you know, cooking ability, right? We all had similar interests. We wanted to cook healthy, not really meat heavy, a lot of plant-based. It's got to be family friendly. Our kids have to eat it, nothing fancy, no French fancy food. We didn't want to be doing desserts, so whatever, you come up with those rules, you find 4 or 5 people that maybe live near you, or maybe you know them through the school or from work, or just friends that you have. They're like, I've been really wanting to cook more. And then you the host will pick a cookbook, and then everybody can share the cookbook or find recipes from it. And then each person cooks a dish. You come together, you share a meal, and you discuss what worked and what didn't work. And there you have it. You've got, 6 dishes prepared from a cookbook that you may never have picked up before because you were scared of it. So that's one idea. And we've been doing this now 2 years, and it's been lovely. And we've really explored. Yesterday we had our cookbook club, and we did Korean food, which I'd never cooked before. So that was really cool because everything was delicious. And then the second thing that really got me, because I didn't always, when I was in my conventional practice, seeing 35 patients a day, working 5 days a week, and I had my little ones who were currently, they're 7 and 9, but they were 2 and 5, 4 at the time. I'd get home and I wasn't cooking. I was exhausted. I was so tired. So we would just be picking up food all the time. I had, delivery apps on my phone. I'd be getting food delivered. And when I went through the fellowship for integrative medicine, I realized, you know what, I've got to change this. And the number one difference that I can make for my family is to be cooking more food at home. And so we started off, I found 2 other friends that live near me, and we started what we call a meal share. And so one day a week, one of us would cook a dinner for all 3 families, and then we would go and deliver it. And it may have been as simple as baked salmon and, a side of spinach and green beans or something, but that way each of our 3 families had a hot meal, to come home to and be able to serve our families. And we had one day during the week where we could kind of spend 2 hours maybe cooking a meal that we were going to kind of experiment with and try out new things, and then serve to 2 other families. So that was another really kind of fun way to approach cooking. And it was so fun to just try, new foods, and our kids were really into it, and they got to try new foods. And it just reinforced and sort of made me a lot more comfortable and excited about being in the kitchen again, because I hadn't been for some years, with my job and with the kids. So I get it. I understand where, people are coming from, but I think it doesn't have to be, it can be fun, and it doesn't have to be difficult to approach.
That's great. That's great advice. And it sounds like you have come a long way, since your conventional practice to now. What are some things that you do on a daily, weekly basis to keep yourself healthy and feeling great?
Great question. So my meditation practice is 100%, my priority. It's been with me since I was probably around 13 to 14 years old. And so that's my daily practice. And now we've gotten my kids into it as well. So they'll come up and do it with me. I think on a daily Basis, we try to get outside. We're in Austin, so you're in Colorado, you're in Boulder, so you're lucky as well. You've got great, places to go hike and all that. But my kids are, they're starting to get into video games, and the screen time thing is always a battle. And so I tell them, all right, you're doing kind of one brain destroying activity. We've got to do one brain building activity. So we get out in nature a lot. We get outside at least every day. And then I think, the other thing that I think has made a big difference in my health is that I do intermittent fast every day. It's something I started about 1.5 years ago, and I did notice a big shift in just my energy and how I feel. So those are kind of my top 3 that it's definitely going to be on a daily basis.
Awesome. And where can people find you? Where can people find your book? Can you tell us a little bit about that before we sign off today?
Absolutely. So I am in Austin, Texas. My website is drshellysethi.com. And so people can find me there. My book is called Built to Thrive, and it is available on Amazon. You can find it there. And occasionally we have free downloadable copies on my website. So from time to time, that's on there as well. But there are some great recipes. You mentioned Indian food. There are some great Indian recipes.
Ooh.
They're handed down from my grandmother to my mom to me. Promise they're not hard at all.
Wow, I'm interested for sure. Love Indian food.
Yeah, and actually I post recipes on my Instagram account as well, and they seem to get a lot of response. So it's Dr. Shelly Sethi on Instagram as well, and I've got recipes there also.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. All the links will be down below too.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.